Well, we're going to get right to it because we have some special guests, and one of them is Ryan Anderson. Ryan is the Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. You might have heard of that lately, especially with the Supreme Court hearings lately. And the founder of and editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. He's the author of When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment and Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. And he's the co-author of What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. Anderson's research has been cited by 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices and in 2 Supreme Court cases. He has made multiple appearances in major news outlets like ABC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox News, as well as being published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many journals. We're very excited to have Ryan with us. Please welcome Ryan Anderson.
Great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here this morning. It's a great privilege to get to spend some time with you this morning. I'm going to be going to the University of Richmond's law school at lunchtime, where I will be protested and met with a drag dance, whatever that is. But it's glad to be able to spend some time with some friendly faces this morning as we think through what's going on in our culture, what's going on, especially with how we think about our own identity as male and female, how we think about our own embodiment, how we think about our humanity, with a particular focus on children, how the next generation is being guided to think about their identity and their embodiment as male or female. Because America's in the midst of what's been called a transgender moment. The subtitle of my book isn't something that I made up. Media on the left and the right, both secular and religious media have referred throughout the past several years to a transgender moment. But not long ago, most Americans hadn't ever really heard, much less thought, about gender identity and transgender identities in particular. And yet today, it's now a cause claiming the mantle of civil rights, all within the space of a couple of years. But is it true that a boy can be trapped in a girl's body? Is our sex assigned to us? Can modern medicine reassign sex? What's the most loving and compassionate response to the condition of gender dysphoria? And what should our laws say about these issues? To a certain extent, these shouldn't be difficult questions. Back in the 1970s, Dr. Paul McHugh thought he had convinced the vast majority of his professional colleagues not to go along with radical claims about gender identity that were first being offered back then. McHugh had received a world-class education, first as an undergraduate at Harvard, and then as a medical student at Harvard Medical School. He was hired by Johns Hopkins. He then became the chair of psychiatry at the medical school and the psychiatrist-in-chief at the hospital. And since you're from Virginia, you know that Johns Hopkins is one of our nation's best hospitals, most elite, most prestigious, and path-setting in many ways. And unfortunately, Johns Hopkins had been a path-setter in the fact that they had opened one of the first sex reassignment clinics a decade or 2 prior to McHugh's arrival. And so when McHugh arrived, when he became the psychiatrist-in-chief, when he became the chair of psychiatry, he asked some of his colleagues to do a study as to what the long-term outcomes had been for the patients who had had sex reassignment procedures. And based upon those results, he had the evidence he needed to convince the administrators at the hospital to shut down the sex reassignment clinic. And sex reassignment clinic at Hopkins, it remained shut down up until 2 years ago, when it reopened, not in light of new evidence, but in light of political pressure and protests, particularly from the Human Rights Campaign. And so today, the people in the spotlight of the transgender moment increasingly are children. It was 11 years ago, in 2007, Boston Children's Hospital became, quote, the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents, end quote. Today, so 11 years later, there are over 45 pediatric gender clinics in the United States. Parents are told that puberty-blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Never mind that the best science on discordant gender identity in children shows that somewhere between 80 to 95% of children will grow out of a gender-confused stage if development is allowed to proceed without interference. Never mind that some of the best studies show that somewhere around 41% of people who identify as transgender will attempt suicide at some point in their lives, and that 19% and that people who have had the reassignment surgery are 19 times more likely than the general population to die by suicide. Those statistics are heartbreaking, and they should cause us to pause before joining the headlong rush into normalizing transgender identities, especially into normalizing transgender identity for children. So what I argue in the book, and what I will share some remarks with you this morning about, is that Dr. McHugh got it right back in the 1970s. That the best psychology, the best biology, the best philosophy, they all reveal that sex is a biological reality, and then gender is how we give expression to that biological reality. Biology isn't bigotry. And human nature hasn't changed in the past 40 years. Human nature hasn't changed from when McHugh first started looking into these things to today, when much of the science has been politicized. Just last week, you might have seen that a researcher at Brown University published a peer-reviewed paper about rapid onset gender dysphoria, and then both the journal and her own university have tried to distance themselves from the paper because it came to a politically incorrect conclusion, saying that it wasn't a result of underlying biology, but partly a result of peer pressure and what's known as social contagion. And because that's not a politically correct conclusion, even though it's a rigorous study published by a professor at Brown, both the university and now the journal are trying to distance themselves from it. But unfortunately, there are human costs to getting human nature wrong. And that's what we're increasingly seeing. And so what I want to do is first go through the title of the presentation is Understanding and Responding to the Transgender Moment. First, I want to help you understand what's going on. And so I want to take some time to just go through what the activists are saying in their own words. And then I want to turn after that to evaluate some of those claims. And right at the beginning, I want to distinguish between the activists, about whom I will have very critical things to say, about the activists, the ideologues. I want to distinguish them from ordinary people who might experience gender dysphoria, ordinary people who might even identify as transgender, the vast majority of whom aren't activists or ideologues of any sort. Many of them are the victims of the activists and the ideologues because they find themselves experiencing unwanted tension, anxiety, displeasure at their own bodies. And when they turn for help, it's the activist and the ideologue who suggests puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, surgery. Right? These individuals, they're just trying to make do with a very bad situation, trying to survive given a situation that none of us would want to experience. Imagine being so uncomfortable in your own body that you would contemplate taking testosterone or estrogen or having a double mastectomy or a hysterectomy. These people are suffering, and it's the activists and the ideologues who are proffering bad advice. And that's who I want to direct these remarks this morning towards. It's the activists and the ideologues. So let me start with what I've referred to as a transgender ontology. An ontology just being the philosopher's big word for being. And they have a certain understanding of being. They have a certain understanding of the human person. And it's a certain understanding of the human person that we are who we claim to be. Right? The argument used to be that someone who was transgender was a male who identifies as a female, or a female who identifies as a man. Now they're saying that a trans woman is a woman. A trans man is a man. Because obviously a claim about who someone is much more effective in the public square than a claim about how someone identifies. And so what they've tried to do is they tried to take an identity claim and turn it into an ontology claim. So these are claims that drip with metaphysical assertion. Even though people say we live in a post-metaphysical era, not true. We just live in an era with a different metaphysic. Now, they don't admit that these are philosophical and theological positions, even though they are, because in our culture, the high priests aren't the priests. In our culture, the high priests are the doctors and the scientists. So what they do is they dress up these claims as if they're scientific and medical claims, because those are the people in our culture with authority. So that's the cover of the book. If we go to the next slide, you'll see an example of this. This is from a professor at Duke University. She's the director of the Center for Child and Adolescent Gender Care. And in an expert declaration to the federal court in North Carolina during the litigation over HB 2, the North Carolina bathroom bill, this is what she told the court. From a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. It is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for purposes of classifying someone as male or female. Now, this is a remarkable set of claims for a variety of reasons. I'll just focus on two. The first is that a generation ago, when the word gender was first applied to people, it was used in distinction to sex. The argument of the second wave feminists was that sex was merely biological, but gender was a social construct, and that these things were different. Now we have a doctor telling a court that your gender identity determines your sex, right? That the one is now parasitic on the other. The other remarkable aspect I'll comment upon here is that just a few years ago, the bread and butter of medical science was chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics. Today, the argument is that it's counter to medical science to point to any aspect of objective reality if it conflicts with someone's subjective identity. Right? And this is what courts of law are supposed to accept. It's not just happening in courts of law, it's also happening in classrooms. So in the next slide, you'll see the genderbread person. The genderbread person is being used to catechize your children and your grandchildren. It's being used to shape how they think about their own identity, their own bodies. And what you'll see is it lists 5 different spectra, different aspects of our humanity. In the brain, it lists gender identity, which it defines as, quote, how you, in your head, define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. It then lists, quote, 4 of infinite possibilities: womanness, manness, two-spirit, and gender queer. And what's trying to be conveyed here is that gender exists along a spectrum. You could be a boy, you could be a girl, you could be both, you could be neither, you could be somewhere in between, and that it's fluid. So it's not just that it exists along a spectrum, but it's fluid. From day to day, your gender identity could change. You could be a boy one day, a girl the next day, both, a third day, neither, on the 4th day. And that the thing that determines your gender identity is how you in your head define it. The next thing that's listed there, the next box down, and this goes from the head to the foot of the genderbread person, is gender expression, which is how you manifest your gender identity. It lists 6 different options of infinite: feminine, masculine, butch, femme, androgynous, or gender neutral. Then it has in the middle of the graphic biological sex, and then it has 2 aspects for what had been understood as sexual orientation, what it lists as sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to, because those things need not line up. You could have sexual attractions in one direction and romantic attractions in a different direction. In fact, none of these things have to line up. You as a child have to determine where you fall on all 5 of these spectrums. And even biological sex, you'll notice, exists along a spectrum. That's why it has those arrows. Now, the genderbread person got in trouble, even though you'll notice this is the most up-to-date version. This is version 3.3. The genderbread got in trouble for 2 reasons. The first is that the genderbread person was accused of supporting the patriarchy because the genderbread person looks like a man. It looks like a gingerbread man. And so even though this was a cutting-edge activist trying to present the most politically correct insights, the graphic fell afoul of other politically correct activists. But then second, it uses a phrase that is now politically incorrect, the phrase biological sex. So the new graphic that they use, next slide please, is the gender unicorn. And so what you'll notice here is that the phrase biological sex has been replaced with the politically correct term sex assigned at birth. And it's no longer something that looks like a human, it's a unicorn, a mythical creature. Right? It's oddly appropriate for what's being presented. But when you saw this, you kind of chuckled, you kind of responded with a roll of your eyes of this is so ridiculous. When your children and your grandchildren see this, it forms their moral imagination. This looks like Barney. This is a cartoon character that's not meant to be persuasive to you or me. This is meant to capture your child's imagination and to help them think about their own identity along these 5 rainbow-colored arrows. So now imagine 2 different young children, one of whom has been catechized according to the gender unicorn, and one of whom has been catechized according to the Westminster Catechism, or the Roman Catholic Catechism, the Baltimore Catechism, whatever. So one believes that the sex was merely assigned at birth, and therefore it can be reassigned later in life, that their gender identity and gender expression exists along spectrums. The other believes that they're created by a loving God, either male or female, where male and female are created for each other. Now, both of these children experience some gender confusion. They experience some gender dysphoria. They don't quite feel comfortable being a little boy or being a little girl. How are they likely to interpret their own thoughts and their own feelings and their own experiences based upon those background convictions? If your background conviction is the gender unicorn, or if your background conviction is Genesis, that's going to influence how you make sense of your life. Right? All of us do this. This isn't just children. All of us, we're narrative beings, and we try to make sense of the narrative of our very lives. And so we interpret our thoughts, we interpret our feelings, we interpret our experiences in light of certain core convictions, in light of certain core beliefs. How do I make sense of what's going on in my life in light of the truth of the gender unicorn or the truth of Genesis? And so you can see how that child's parents, the child's guidance counselor at school, the child's physician, the child's counselor, they would come to radically different conclusions about what's in the best interest of the child, what is the best care for the child, based upon their worldview. Worldview really matters here. The next slide just gives you an explanation for why the people who made this graphic chose to use sex assigned at birth. They claim that, quote, biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale and no meaning, besides that it's related to some sex characteristics. It's also harmful to trans people. Instead, we prefer sex assigned at birth, which provides a more accurate description of what biological sex may be trying to communicate. It's obviously not more accurate. It's an idealized concept to suggest that it was merely assigned to you by a doctor at birth, and therefore we, your physicians, can reassign it later in life. That's what's really taking place here. And of course, that immediately leads to what I'm going to describe as transgender medicine. Right? The transgender worldview, the ontology, the metaphysics, how we view the human person, the anthropology, that influences how we treat human persons, how we respond to human suffering. And so I want to share with you the official 4-part standard of care that the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Experts, WPATH, and the Endocrine Society and other professional associations have promulgated for the care of children with gender dysphoria. And so the first step is what's known as social transition. A child as young as 3 years of age should be given a new name and a new pronoun and a new wardrobe and access to new bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams, et cetera, if the child is persistent, consistent, and insistent that they're actually the opposite sex. So the argument here is that your kindergartner, if they insist consistently and insistently that they're actually a boy or a girl, you should treat them as if they are that boy or girl. A new name, a new wardrobe, a new pronoun, and then for the policy side, new bathrooms and locker rooms. The second step of the treatment protocol is as that child approaches puberty, they should be, quote, prevented from going through puberty in the wrong body. So this is where puberty-blocking drugs are used off-label. They're not FDA approved for this purpose, but they're used to indefinitely block puberty so that that boy or that girl won't go through all of the bodily changes that helps a boy develop into a man or a girl develop into a woman. This then leads to the third part of the treatment protocol, because now you have a teenager who is still trapped in a child's body. So the third step is at age 16, but increasingly doctors are arguing it should start taking place at age 14. These teenagers should be given cross-sex hormones. Girls who identify as boys should be given testosterone to masculinize their bodies, and boys who identify as girls should be given estrogen to feminize their bodies. The idea here is that we should mimic puberty, but of the correct gender identity. This then sets up the fourth stage of the treatment protocol. Not everyone goes through all four stages. This is the surgical stage. The current recommendations are at age 18, although again, some physicians are arguing it should be at age 16. And this is where you can have surgical procedures to remove those internal reproductive organs, those external genitalia, those secondary sex characteristics, and then try to create something using plastic surgery to resemble the opposite sex's sex organs, with varying levels of both cosmetic success and functionality. Why do the experts embrace this four-part standard of care? One aspect here in the next slide I'll show you comes from another physician in an expert declaration to a federal court. And Dr. Leibowitz declared, peer-reviewed research demonstrates that pre-pubertal children asserting a different gender identity from the one they were assigned at birth are cognitively capable enough to be aware of the gender they are asserting. The meaning of a child's gender identity assertion at a younger age is no less valid than the meaning of a gender identity assertion of an older child. So when some of you thought that I was being facetious or ridiculous when I said a 3-year-old should be given a new name and a new wardrobe and a new pronoun, that a 9-year-old should be placed on puberty-blocking drugs, the reason why that is the recommendation is because peer-reviewed research shows that these pre-pubertal children are cognitively capable enough to be aware that they're actually the opposite sex. And so your job as parents or as medical professionals is to affirm their transgender identity, first through a social transition, then through blocking development in the wrong body, then through hormonal and possibly surgical transition. Let's go to the next slide to give you an idea of what the argument here is. Children know a lot about themselves and their gender from a very early age, and whether they reveal themselves to be gender expansive, transgender, or neither, the most important thing we can do is listen to what our children are telling us and really hear them. And what they mean by this is listen to them, hear them, and then uncritically accept what they're telling us at face value and affirm it. Right? That's the part. It's as if the options are listen to them or reject them. And there's no third option of listen to them and then help guide them in the direction of the truth. Right? They leave that option off the table. The other thing to notice, this is a group that just goes by its initials now, because when they were founded as a gay rights group, they left the T out of their acronym. So you notice it's Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. They forgot the T for transgender, which just shows you how new so many of these claims are, that even some of the gay activist groups weren't aware of the trans claims that were going to be coming. So when they named themselves, They didn't include the entire LGBT, et cetera, acronym as it ever grows. In the next slide, you can see the director of mental health at the Children's Hospital for the University of California at San Francisco, explaining that transgender children are like left-handed people, only a small minority of the general population, and like left-handed people, they are a variation of human development that is to be celebrated and honored rather than punished or denied. They are our best teachers in alerting us to the reality that gender exists primarily between our ears, in our brains and minds, and not necessarily by what's between our legs, our genitalia, or our accompanying chromosomes, as many are mistakenly prone to believe. We demonstrate how much we have yet to learn when we say, but honey, you can't be a girl, you're a boy because you have a penis. What's interesting to point out here is that notice again the false dichotomy. Transgender identity is either to be celebrated and honored or punished and denied. Right? There's not a third option of recognizing that you have feelings of dysphoria and then helping you to feel comfortable in your own body. Right? That option seems left off the table. In the next slide, Dr. Aronsoft continues, they refuse to pin themselves down as either male or a female. Maybe they're a boy-girl or a gender hybrid or gender ambidextrous, moving freely between genders, living somewhere in between, and creating their own mosaic of gender identity and expression. As they grow older, they might identify themselves as agender or gender neutral or gender queer. Each one of these children is exercising their gender creativity, and we can think of them as our gender creative children. This is the director of mental health at the University Hospital for Children at the University of California, San Francisco. So if you're an unsuspecting parent and your child is experiencing gender dysphoria and all you want is what's best for your child, and so you go to the local hospital that just opened a gender clinic, and you don't know any better, you're just gonna defer to the expert, this is the type of advice you could be receiving. And notice what's remarkable about this quote where she says, as they grow older, their gender identity and their gender expression might change. And yet Dr. Aronsoft recommends radical medical interventions in the body of these young people based upon what their current gender identity and expression is. Puberty blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, even while acknowledging that as they grow older, their gender identity might change, and yet she's gonna make permanent and radical changes to their bodies. That's what's going on right now in these 45 pediatric gender clinics. So I mentioned the vision of the human person, which gives rise to a certain vision for medicine. That also leads to the demands that are made on law and public policy. And so I wanna go through this a little more quickly, just in the interest of time. I wanna go through 4 different policy aspects. And you've already seen some of this take place right here in Virginia, some of it taking place right here in Richmond. So you'll be familiar with some of this. But the first is a question of, what will children be taught? What will your local school children in the local public schools be taught as true about human sexuality and gender identity? Will the genderbread person and the gender unicorn be used at your local school to indoctrinate people into believing that that's the truth about the human person, the human body, the human identity? The second question, how will schools and other public places govern access to sex-specific facilities? So bathrooms, locker rooms, dorm rooms, hotel rooms for field trips, sports teams, anywhere where we have separate male and female, boy and girl programs and facilities, will they be based on biological reality or will they be based on gender identity? How are you going to govern all of those programs? The third question, will you be forced to speak someone else's reality, someone else's truth? And what I mean by this is that we've already seen in New York City, a law has been passed where you could be fined up to $250,000 if you intentionally misgender someone. Jordan Peterson first came to kind of international fame when he said he wasn't going to go along with the University of Toronto's pronoun policy. Will you be forced to speak someone else's beliefs, or will you be able to speak your own beliefs? And then lastly, how will we govern the provision of medical services? In the last year of the previous administration, a regulation was issued by the Department of Health and Human Services. It was like the contraception mandate, except it was on steroids, because what it required was all healthcare plans to cover both hormonal and surgical transition procedures, and all relevant physicians to perform them. There was a lawsuit, much like the Little Sisters of the Poor or Hobby Lobby. There was a lawsuit against this. On New Year's Eve, just before midnight, a federal judge struck down the mandate, put an injunction on it because it was to go into effect New Year's Day. And then when the Trump administration took office 3 weeks later, they didn't challenge that court ruling. But had we had a different result of the election, had there been a different administration, they probably would have fought that judge's ruling. There's a chance that that HHS regulation would still be in effect. And what it would require is every healthcare plan would have to cover reassignment procedures, both hormonal and surgical, and there were no age limitations. This means for both adults and children, and physicians would have to perform them. And what I mean by that is that if you're an endocrinologist, a hormone specialist that would do testosterone therapy for a man with low testosterone, you'd have to do it for a woman who wants to identify as a man, or for a teenage girl who wants to identify as a teenage boy. If you were a surgeon who would perform a double mastectomy or a hysterectomy in the case of cancer, you'd have to perform it for a woman who wants to transition to live as a man. This regulation from HHS had no religious liberty exemptions, it had no conscience protections, and it had no considerations at all simply for best medical judgment. Many physicians, regardless of their religious or moral beliefs, simply think transitioning is bad medicine, that the appropriate therapeutic response is counseling to help people feel comfortable in their own bodies, not trying to transform their bodies. Several states have also passed laws that prohibit good medicine. So that HHS regulation would have mandated what many physicians believe to be bad medicine. Several states have passed laws that prohibit physicians from doing what they call, quote, conversion therapy. And what they mean by this is that if you are Dr. McHugh at Hopkins and you're meeting with a minor, a 12-year-old boy who doesn't feel comfortable being a boy, but he thinks he's a girl, and you talk to that 12-year-old boy and you explore with him why he thinks he's a girl and what you can do to help him feel comfortable being a boy, you are converting his true gender identity. And there are now, I believe, 12 states that have passed laws banning that sort of medical practice. By contrast, in all 50 states, you can engage in what they refer to as gender-affirming therapy, where you help that boy identify and live as a girl. You won't lose your medical license for doing gender-affirming therapy. You could lose it in 12 states if you're helping someone identify with their body. And already we've seen the first case in the United States of parents losing custody of a child because they didn't want their 17-year-old daughter to transition and to receive testosterone therapy. And this case didn't take place in California or New York or Massachusetts. This case took place in Ohio, the heartland. If we can skip the next slide and go to the one after that, just for the sake of time. Here you see the bottom line for schools. Ultimately, the school environment must be set up so that transgender girls are treated like all other girls and transgender boys like all other boys. Remember that a transgender girl is a boy who identifies as a girl. So that boy who identifies as a girl has to be treated like all the other girls when it comes to bathrooms, locker rooms, showers, sports teams, dorms for college, hotels for field trips. And also notice that this handbook, it's being made by the ACLU, 3 different LGBT activist groups, and the National Education Association. The largest teachers union in our country partnered with a liberal law firm and 3 LGBT activist groups to create the official guidebook that schools are supposed to use on how to handle gender identity and transgender students. And then in the next slide, you'll see the concerns for privacy. Privacy in the next slide. There we go. Privacy and confidentiality are critically important for transgender students who do not have supportive families. In those situations, even inadvertent disclosures could put the student in a potentially dangerous situation at home, so it's important to have a plan in place to avoid any mistakes or slip-ups. What they're talking about here is how your school can have a plan for students to transition on campus without their parents knowing about it. So that you could drop off your high school freshman boy at 8 a.m., and he would go to the principal's office, where he would be given a new wardrobe, a dress, maybe makeup, maybe lipstick. He would spend the day at school presenting as if female, with the teachers using a new name and new pronouns, and then at the end of the day go back to the principal's office, change out of those clothes, and be picked up with you as the parent never knowing this is going on. The privacy and the confidentiality are the students, and that subverts parental authority, and it's not the other students. So the other students at the school are not to be told that a boy who identifies as a girl will be using their bathrooms or their locker rooms or their showers. They can't violate the privacy and the confidentiality of the student who identifies as transgender. The privacy of all the other students doesn't matter, and the authority of the parents doesn't matter. All right, let me pivot and start evaluating some of this. What should we think about this? Let me say a little bit about the philosophy, a little bit about the science, and then a little bit about the medicine, and then I'm going to be out of time. First, the philosophy. The transgender worldview combines a new form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism, in which the real self is something other than the material body, while simultaneously embracing materialism, in which only physical bodies exist. So what I want to highlight now are all of the contradictions, philosophical contradictions in the transgender worldview. Many of these activists are convicted materialists. Only physical matter exists. And yet they also think the real self is something other than the physical body, so that you could be trapped in the wrong physical body. And yet both of those things can't be true. Who or what is the real self that is trapped in the wrong body? The transgender worldview, as you saw from one of those quotes from Dr. Aronsoft, it insists that gender exists between our ears, in our brains and minds, and not with what's between our legs. And yet it also wants to radically reconstruct what's between our legs. If gender exists in our thoughts, in our brains, in our minds, why do we have to radically transform our bodies? Why can't you just be a girl who enjoys G.I. Joe, or a boy who enjoys Barbie? Why are those a sign that you're actually a boy trapped in a girl's body or a girl trapped in a boy's body? Which leads to the next set of contradictions, is that the transgender worldview, it actually is relying upon rigid sex stereotypes, where boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls. And yet it also insists that gender is purely a social construct, so there are no meaningful differences between boys and girls. But it also insists that gender identity is real and meaningful, but human embodiment is not. You can't keep all of those contradictory views simultaneously. And then lastly, it embraces a radical expressive individualism, where we're each supposed to be able to define the truth as we wish it to be and to live our lives as we want. But it enforces a ruthless paternalism, where anyone who dissents from the transgender worldview will be ridiculed and punished and platformed in silence and eventually coerced. Parents lose custody, doctors lose medical license. Right? So liberty for me, conformity for thee. Let me just ask you a couple of questions to highlight some of those contradictions. If gender is a social construct, how can gender identity be innate and immutable and determined by biology in the womb? Right? How could my identity with respect to a social construct be biologically determined? And if the social construct is something that's ever changing, how could my gender identity be immutable? Right? There's some tension here in their theories about gender and gender identity. But even if you accept the idea of gender identity as an internal sense of gender, what does gender feel like? For the women in the room, what does it feel like to be a woman? Are all of you feeling the same way right now? how do you even know if you're feeling the same type of woman feelings as your neighbor's feeling? Or is something else what defines you all as women? Is it's not how you feel, but it's actually who you are, your embodiment. It's your female embodiment that defines you as a woman, not an internal sense of feeling like a woman. How would I know if I felt like a woman? Right? There's an epistemological problem here. As a guy, how would I know what it's like to feel like a woman? And then why should feeling like a woman, whatever that is, make me a woman? Right? We don't say that our feelings define reality on anything else. No one went along with Rachel Dolezal, the white woman who felt like she was black and who identified as African American, who was running her local NAACP chapter. Right? They didn't say she was transracial. So why do we say that people are transgender? Every now and again, you'll see media stories, which I think are unfortunate because I think the media is exploiting these people, but media stories highlighting people who are trans species. The most recent one I saw was it's a new article of an old story, but of a woman who has transformed herself into a dragon. And she's forked her tongue, so her tongue now has 2 points. She's had lots of tattoos, lots of plastic surgery on her face. No one thinks that this human being is actually a dragon. So why do we think that our feelings determine our sexual identity? So that's some of the philosophical comments. Let me talk about some of the science. First, contrary to what the activists say, our sex isn't assigned to us at birth. Our sex is a bodily reality that can be recognized long before birth. Many of you are now finding out the sex of your children and grandchildren at about 20 weeks in utero through an ultrasound image. And the sex wasn't assigned at ultrasound. What that ultrasound image does is it reveals a reality. The ultrasound technician can look on a grainy black and white screen and discern, is your child a boy or is your child a girl, based upon how the body is organized. Organisms are organized in various ways, and when it comes to human beings and all mammals, there are 2 ways of being organized with respect to sexual reproduction. This is why there's a sexual binary. There are 2 sets of sex chromosomes, XX and XY. They give rise to the development of 2 sets of sex organs, internal reproductive organs, 2 sets of external genitalia, 2 sets of sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, and then secondary sex characteristics. In other words, all of those things that Dr. Adkins said were contrary to medical science are the exact physical realities that help us identify not just human beings, but organisms across the animal kingdom as male or female. Are you organized with respect to sexual reproduction along a male trajectory, which takes place at conception, with the chromosomes you inherited from your parents, with the hormones that those chromosomes initiate the production of, with the organs that are then developed, with an entire reproductive system, or are you organized as a female? This is why it's not fluid, it doesn't exist along a spectrum, it's a stable binary. And that's not to deny that there are disorders of sexual development, just as there are disorders of all aspects of human development. Disorders of cardiac development we call heart disease, disorders of respiratory development we call lung disease. And so too, the colloquial terms had been hermaphrodites or intersex conditions. There are disorders of sexual development where the sexual reproductive system doesn't fully develop. But that has very little, if anything, to do with transgender identities. These are people who have fully developed sexual bodies, but who identify as something else. The last thing to say about this science point is that just as sex isn't assigned to us in the first place, so too modern medicine can't reassign sex later in life. There's no way of going back and undoing all the chromosomal imprinting of every cell in our body, the influence of the hormones, the development of internal reproductive organs, external genitalia. What you can do is you can amputate and remove certain body parts, and then you can use both plastic surgery and hormone therapy to try to feminize and masculinize a body. So in the next slide, you'll see Dr. Larry Mayer. Scientifically speaking, transgender men are not biological men, and transgender women are not biological women. The claims to the contrary are not supported by a scintilla of scientific evidence. And then the next slide from Robert George at Princeton University, changing sexes is a metaphysical impossibility because it's a biological impossibility. So let me now close with some comments about the medicine. Just as sex reassignment fails to reassign sex as a physical matter, so too the best evidence here suggests that it fails to bring the wholeness and the happiness that people are looking for as a psychosocial matter. What I mean by that is that even where the surgery and the hormone therapy goes well as a technical cosmetic matter, and even in cultures that are very supportive of people who identify as transgender, they still face increased risks and struggles. And so the next slide you'll see from Dr. McHugh, an essay that he wrote shortly after Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner. Transgender men do not become women, nor do transgender women become men. All become feminized men or masculinized women, counterfeits or impersonators of the sex with which they identify. In that lies their problematic future. When the tumult and shouting dies, it proves not easy nor wise to live in a counterfeit sexual garb. The most thorough follow-up of sex reassigned people, extending over 30 years and conducted in Sweden, where the culture is strongly supportive of the transgender, documents their lifelong mental unrest. 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who'd undergone reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of comparable peers. And it's not just Dr. McHugh who is saying this, it's not just that Swedish study. I want to very quickly go through a number of slides just to show you literature reviews, independent organizations that have looked at hundreds of studies. So in the next slide, you'll see this is a 2004 literature review that The Guardian, this is a newspaper in the United Kingdom, they asked Birmingham University to conduct a literature review, and this is how The Guardian describes it. So they're speaking of themselves. Guardian Weekend asked Birmingham University's aggressive research facility to assess the findings of more than 100 follow-up studies of post-op transsexuals. ARIF, which conducts reviews of the healthcare treatments for the NHS, concludes that none of the studies provides conclusive evidence that gender reassignment is beneficial for patients. It found that most research was poorly designed, which skewed the results in favor of physically changing sex. There was no evaluation of whether other treatments, such as long-term counseling, might help transsexuals, or whether their gender confusion might lessen over time. So that was back in 2004. Jump forward a decade. So now 2014, the next slide. This comes from Hayes Incorporated, which is a consulting company that hospitals and health insurance companies use to advise on whether or not they should cover certain procedures. Statistically significant improvements have not been consistently demonstrated by multiple studies for most outcomes. Evidence regarding quality of life and function in male to female adults was very sparse. Evidence for less comprehensive measures of well-being in adult recipients of cross-sex hormone therapy was directly applicable to gender dysphoria patients, but was sparse and or conflicting. The study designs do not permit conclusions of causalities, and studies generally had weaknesses associated with execution. There are potentially long-term safety risks associated with hormone therapy, but none have been proven or conclusively ruled out. So that's 4 years ago, admitting that the science here is incredibly bad, it's sparse or non-existent, and the study designs are really bad. And yet what you will see repeatedly in the media today is that there's a consensus that the science is settled, that the best thing you can do for your child or even for an adult is to transition. 14 years ago, Birmingham University admitted that wasn't there. 4 years ago, Hayes Incorporated admitted that wasn't there. 2 years ago, the Obama administration admitted it wasn't there. So in the next slide, you'll see the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, a June 2016 proposed decision memo. Based on a thorough review of the clinical evidence available at this time, there is not enough evidence to determine whether gender reassignment surgery improves health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries with gender dysphoria. There were conflicting, inconsistent study results. Of the best designed studies, some reported benefits while others reported harms. The quality and strength of evidence was low due to the mostly observational study designs with no comparison groups, potential confounding, small sample sizes. Many studies that reported positive outcomes were exploratory type studies with no confirmatory follow-up. And let's skip two slides ahead. One back, sorry. There you go. The majority, and this is from their decision memos, this is the final memo, the majority of studies were non-longitudinal, meaning they're not throughout time, exploratory type studies, or did not include concurrent controls or testing before and after surgery. Several reported positive results, but the potential issues noted above reduced strength and confidence. After careful assessment, we identified 6 studies that could provide useful information. Of these, the 4 best designed and conducted studies that assessed quality of life before and after surgery did not demonstrate clinically significant changes or differences in test results after gender reassignment surgery. So think about what this means. This is August of 2016, exactly 2 years ago. The Obama administration admits that the best studies do not show clinically significant changes after sex reassignment procedures. So you as a patient, you're suffering, and you're suffering to such a great extent that you would contemplate taking estrogen or testosterone. You would contemplate removing your breasts, removing your uterus, having plastic surgery to recreate these body parts. And then the outcomes, no clinically significant change. All of those underlying problems persist. That's what McHugh was suggesting, saying that it's neither easy nor wise to live in counterfeit sensual garb. His phrase there is that the underlying problems, the anxiety, the depression, the substance abuse, the sex reassignment doesn't cure those underlying problems, and in some cases, it'll make it possibly worse. So in the next slide, the Obama administration points to that same Swedish study. It says the mortality was primarily due to completed suicides, 19.1-fold greater than in control Swedes. And then the next sentence, we note, mortality from this patient population did not become apparent until after 10 years. So another thing that the media won't tell you, they'll point to Caitlyn Jenner and say, look at how wonderful things are. What they won't do is, how are things gonna be 10 years from now? They'll point to Jazz Jennings, the teenager who just recently transitioned. They won't do the long-term follow-up. What the Swedish study shows is that at first, people can be pleased with the results of their surgery. It's gone well as a cosmetic matter. They finally got what they were looking for. But then life continues, and life is difficult. It's neither easy nor wise to live as if the opposite sex. And then the Obama administration here, pointing to that Swedish study, it's 10 years later that those increased rates of mortality, including a 19.1 times greater likelihood of death by suicide, manifest. So I'm getting the hook. I've just gotten the symbol that I'm out of time. The MC has taken his chair. So I'll stop there, but I do want to add one thing of hope, is that there is an alternative. What Dr. McHugh suggests, what many therapists suggest, is that you talk with young people about why they think they're trapped in the wrong body. What is it about being a boy that they find problematic? What is it about being a girl that they find attractive? What is it that would solve? What problem in their life would be solved by becoming a girl? You talk to them, you try to understand what's underlying the dysphoria, and then you direct your response at those underlying problems. Sometimes it can be trauma, sometimes it can be bullying, sometimes it can be family dynamics. There are a variety of underlying causes, and what a good therapist tries to do is discern what is the underlying cause for this individual, and how can we remedy it. Thank you.
Well, welcome back to our live stream of the Family Foundation of Virginia Pastor Summit. Again, I'm Brandon Pickett here with Ryan Anderson. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much. Well, that was amazing. And I just, people were taking notes. We have 400 or 500 people here. You even said you were kind of excited to see this many people.
It was great. I mean, to see this many people show up on a random Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., which I think shows that so many people care about this issue. And they don't think they're getting the full truth from the media, right? And so it's great that the Family Foundation sponsors something like this. It's great that we have so many civic leaders showing up to hear about it, because we need to realize that we're at the beginning of a conversation, not the end. Lots of activists on the left wanted to say that the conversation is done, and we already know what the conclusion is.
They say it's settled science.
It's settled science, it's settled law. It's entirely unsettled. We're at the infancy of our understanding of gender dysphoria and the effective, appropriate responses to gender dysphoria. And so we need to keep an open mind, and we need to be thinking about these things critically, because if we get them wrong, there's serious suffering that could result.
You mentioned Transgender Moment. Where did that come from?
Yeah, so I first saw the phrase in the headlines, both on secular press and conservative press, religious press and secular press. I was seeing it in Christianity Today and the New York Times. And what they were describing was something is happening in our culture that we're now in this transgender moment. There were transgender TV stars, transgender politicians, all these transgender public policies and laws. So I latched onto that for the subtitle of the book. It's, When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. Because what I like about that is it suggests that it's not here forever. That this moment could pass with the appropriate response. And so that, our job, your job, my job, the people here today, is to speak the truth in love so that the next generation doesn't repeat this misguided moment.
Let me ask you then, and this is probably my last question because of time purposes, but as you speak the truth in love, a lot of times we speak on social media.
Right.
And it's so easy in that veil of social media where I'm not talking to you face to face. We can say things and hurt people and not really help the cause.
Oh, yeah.
How do we do that on social media?
A couple suggestions. One is never respond in the heat of the moment, right? Draft your response if you're going to do a tweet or whatever, and then wait 5 minutes. Go for a walk, get a cup of coffee, revisit it, and your chances are you can turn down the snark a little bit. And then also realize that, the conversation is not just between you and whoever you're replying to on Twitter. There are thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people looking in. And what you want to do is model the type of behavior, the type of language that you want everyone else using, right? And so your public persona on social media should be better than your personal persona because you're being an example to other people.
That's a great point. Right now, you have your latest book is?
When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. And it goes through in greater detail what I just went through this morning very briefly, but it's meant to be accessible to anyone with a high school education. I have a PhD, but this is a book written for people who don't have PhDs. It's so that every mom and dad, every student in the country could read this and understand what's going on and how we should respond.
Yeah, and you delve into science here, but also you delve into other things, emotional well-being, and I saw even there are some statistics of 10 and 20 years later when someone has come out as transgender and what happens to them later.
Yeah, I mean, so what's unique about this book is that it's interdisciplinary. And the only reason I could do this is I had a lot of help from professors of law, professor of medicine, professor of biology, neuroscience, psychiatry, people who could help me with various fine-tuning of arguments. And so the statistic you mentioned is that one of the best, most robust studies that we have on the long-term outcomes for people who have had sex reassignment surgery shows that they're 19.1 times more likely than the general population to die by suicide. Now, we don't know, did the reassignment surgery cause this? Did it make it worse? Did it make it better? We just know what the outcome is. People who have had the surgery 19 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population, which simply suggests to me that at the very least, reassignment isn't working. Because none of us would want that type of an outcome for any of our loved ones. And so we have to do a better job at working to find solutions that'll bring that wholeness, that happiness that people are seeking.
Thank you so much for peeling the layers back that we don't see in the paper, on TV, on the internet. Thank you so much for that. I know you've got to go sign some books, but again, this is Ryan Anderson. Thank you so much from the Heritage Foundation for being with us.
Thank you.
And we're going to continue this live stream in just a moment, right from the Family Foundation of Virginia 2018 Pastors Summit, Ministry in an Age of Gender Confusion.